Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before a military convoy would surround his hospital demanding answers he didn't have. Laura Bennett moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Seattle General in Savannah with the kind of quietness that made people forget she was there exactly how she needed it. 3 months into her night shift rotation, she'd become invisible, competent hands that never trembled during for insertions, a face that showed nothing when doctors barked orders, eyes that tracked everything while revealing nothing. In her locker sat a pair of worn combat boots she couldn't bring herself to wear, wrapped in her son's last letter from Fallujah. The faint scar tissue on her knuckles caught the light when she scrubbed in old rope burns, the kind you get rappelling from helicopters, not from nursing school. She had a tell when stressed, her jaw would clench once, barely perceptible, then release. Dr. Whitfield arrived for morning rounds with his usual entourage, his eyes scanning the staff like a predator assessing threats. He had no idea that the quiet night nurse represented the only thing that could unravel 15 years of carefully constructed fraud. The briefing room smelled of stale coffee and something antiseptic, the particular reek of a hospital that never fully aired out. 12 nurses and 4 residents sat in folding chairs, waiting. Dr. Whitfield stood at the front like a man who owned the room, because in a meaningful way, he did. The ICU bed allocations flowed through his hands. The consultant referrals that meant billable hours came from his office. The phantom procedures, the ones that appeared on charts but never actually happened, the ones that funneled kickbacks through shell companies registered in Delaware, those were his architecture. Nobody in the room knew that. They knew Dr. Whitfield as demanding, brilliant, occasionally cruel. A man with a voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and heavy and impossible to ignore. "I want to talk about efficiency," he said, pacing the front of the room. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the linoleum with each step. "About commitment. About understanding that this hospital operates on a margin that doesn't tolerate dead weight." He paused. His eyes found Laura sitting in the back row, hands folded in her lap. "Some of our night staff seem to think they can coast. Show up, collect a paycheck, leave." He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've made a public bet with the board, our newest nurse, the quiet one, the one who pretends she doesn't understand how things actually work here, will be gone in 7 days. 1 week. She'll quit because the pressure will be too much, because she'll realize she's out of her depth, because she'll understand that some people are simply made for better things." The room went dead silent. Residents shifted in their chairs. 2 of the nurses glanced at Laura, who hadn't moved. Her jaw clenched. Once. Then released. "Anyone want to take the other side of that bet?" Dr. Whitfield asked. Nobody moved. "That's what I thought. Everyone here understands how this works. Everyone except one." He looked directly at her again. "Except you, apparently." Laura returned his gaze with the kind of flatness that gave away nothing. A 15-year habit. A survival mechanism carved into bone. The briefing continued for another 20 minutes, updates on ICU sensors, notes about a new ventilator protocol, reminders about documentation standards. None of it landed in Laura's mind. She was already 3 steps ahead, already planning which shifts to volunteer for, which doctors to stay visible to, which paths through the hospital kept her in motion and therefore harder to target. She'd done this before. Different uniforms, same predators. 42 minutes after Dr. Whitfield's announcement, Laura was in the hospital cafeteria at 1,100 hours, standing in line for a tray of overcooked green beans and what might have been chicken. The place was crowded, lunch shift overflow, residents grabbing food between cases, attending physicians in their white coats clustered at one corner table like wolves at a kill. The fluorescent lights hummed their industrial song, a sound that had learned to tune out somewhere around hour 40 of her shifts this week. Dr. Whitfield entered from the corridor, moving with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. 3 medical students trailed behind him like remora fish following a shark. He was speaking loudly about a case, something about a septic patient, something about how most nurses would miss the early signs because they lacked intellectual rigor. His voice filled the space. He moved directly toward the beverage station, and in doing so, directly into Laura's path. She was holding her tray at waist height, moving toward an empty table. Her hands were steady. The tray was balanced with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory and 15 years of knowing that control is survival. Dr. Whitfield didn't slow down. He didn't acknowledge her. He simply let his shoulder connect with the tray as he passed, a movement that might have been accidental if his eyes hadn't been locked on hers the entire time. The tray fell. Green beans scattered across the tile floor like small broken promises. The chicken hit first, then the water glass, which shattered. The sound echoed, a crash that had no place in the cafeteria's normal frequency. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The medical students watched, their eyes bright with the terrible interest of witnesses to something they didn't quite understand but recognized as significant. The social hierarchy was being established. The pecking order was being redrawn. Dr. Whitfield stopped walking. He turned back toward her, his expression arranged into something between amusement and contempt. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. Loud enough that 30 people heard it. The words fell like a gauntlet. Like a challenge issued in front of an audience. Like a test designed specifically to measure whether she would break. "And maybe you should stay late to clean it properly. Seems like your attention to detail could use work." Laura looked at him for exactly 1 second. Her jaw was clenched. The muscles in her neck were tight. But her eyes were like storm clouds holding electricity, dangerous and still. The medical students were watching to see if she would tremble. If she would speak. If she would retreat to the back hallway to cry, as though she were a person capable of breaking. They were wrong. They didn't know that she'd survived things that made a dropped tray of food look like a small mercy. She set her empty hands flat against the front of her scrubs, released her breath slowly, and knelt. The tile was cold against her shins. The broken pieces of the glass cup reflected the fluorescent lights in fractured pieces. She moved with mechanical precision, collecting the green beans first, placing them on a napkin she'd extracted from her pocket. Her hands were perfectly steady. Not the steadiness of someone trying to appear composed. The steadiness of someone whose hands had held lives together in aircraft fuselages and battlefield medical tents while IEDs detonated half a mile away. Steadiness that ran deeper than the social moment. Deeper than shame, deeper than humiliation, deeper than anything a man with Italian leather shoes could manufacture. The water pooled around her. The fragments of glass she placed carefully in her palm, cutting slightly into her skin in 3 places. She didn't acknowledge the blood. She stood, her knees still creaking slightly from the kneeling position, and faced Dr. Whitfield. "I'll get a mop," she said quietly. 10 words or fewer. A statement of fact. No apology. No deference beyond the bare minimum required to continue existing in this space. Her voice had dropped half an octave from the morning briefing. It was the voice of someone who'd learned a long time ago that power was something you carried in your posture, not your words. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she walked directly back to her shift without eating, without sitting, without taking the coffee break that might have made the rest of the day survivable. The worst part was that she understood exactly what was happening, that Dr. Whitfield had marked her as a target, that the public bet in the briefing had been the opening move, that knocking her tray to the floor had been the escalation. The worst part was that she'd already begun calculating how to survive it, and she knew, with the kind of certainty that came from experience, that Dr. Whitfield had no idea what he'd just set in motion. He thought he was breaking someone ordinary. Someone without resources, without a history, without anything hidden beneath the surface except fear and the desire to keep her job. He couldn't have been more wrong. But he wouldn't understand that until it was too late, until the truth walked through the hospital's front doors in the form of people with authority that transcended his, until the quiet nurse revealed exactly who she'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time. For now, she simply returned to the ICU, washed the blood from her hands with the kind of care she applied to everything, and settled into the rhythm of her shift. The monitors beeped. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The fluorescent lights continued their industrial hum. She worked with the kind of invisibility that had kept her alive for 15 years. And she waited. 48 minutes later, the doors to the emergency room opened. EMTs wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man in his mid-50s, unconscious, no wallet, no phone, barely coherent enough to acknowledge their names. His shirt was torn. His skin was grey from something that looked like cardiac compromise. He had the kind of bearing, even collapsed and half gone, that spoke of military service. Even unconscious, he moved with the residue of discipline. Laura stood at the entrance to the ICU, watching the paramedics work their way through triage. And that was when everything changed. That was when the two threads of her life, the one she was living and the one she'd spent 15 years trying to bury, began to braid together in ways she couldn't have predicted. The unidentified John Doe arrived at Seattle General's emergency department at 1900 hours on a Tuesday, brought in by ambulance from the VA clinic on Victory Drive. EMTs reported finding him collapsed outside the entrance, no wallet, no identification, barely conscious, muttering numbers that sounded like grid coordinates to anyone who'd ever heard them before. The ER physician, Dr. Chen, dismissed him immediately, another homeless vet, probably drunk. Bed 7, start fluids, move on. But Laura saw what the others missed. His muscle tone. The discipline in his movements even while unconscious. The way his hands formed tactical grips even as they trembled. This wasn't a vagrant. This was someone trained. Someone whose body still remembered how to survive. She took vitals while Dr. Whitfield stood in the doorway, arms crossed, radiating impatience like heat off asphalt. BP 118/72. Heart rate steady at 62. Oxygen sat normal. But something else was wrong, a subtle asymmetry in his chest wall, a faint distension in the jugular vein that shouldn't be there, not yet. Laura's hands moved on their own, checking, probing, reading the language of trauma that her own body had learned to speak 15 years ago. While searching his jacket for any identification, her fingers found a small plastic rectangle buried deep in the inner pocket, sewn into the lining as if someone had meant it to stay hidden. She pulled it free. Military ID. Name embossed in raised letters, Colonel James Riker. Unit designation, 75th Ranger Regiment. Date of service, still active. The world tilted. Just slightly. Just enough that Laura had to grip the stretcher rail to steady herself. Colonel James Riker. Her son had written about him 17 times in the letters that came home, those thin pages covered in careful handwriting that spoke of a man who taught honor, who led from the front, who'd saved lives in the rubble of Fallujah. My CO is the best officer I've ever known, he'd written. If something happens to me, you can trust that he did everything he could. 3 weeks after that last letter arrived, the condolence letter came from James Riker himself, his signature precise and military-formal, but the words beneath carried the weight of someone who understood loss at a depth that most people never reach. Laura had read it once, then locked it away with the combat boots her son had shipped home before his final deployment, the only physical reminder that he'd ever existed at all. She palmed the ID and slipped it into her scrubs pocket without changing her expression, without even pausing in her assessment of the patient's pupils. The military ID rested against her ribs, a piece of evidence that protocol demanded she report immediately to hospital administration, that demanded she acknowledge a connection that could compromise her objectivity, that could trigger questions about Laura Bennett's background, questions she could never afford to answer truthfully. Instead, she continued her examination, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she adjusted the oxygen delivery, checked the cardiac monitor leads, initiated the standard for protocol that any trained nurse would perform. But her mind was already calculating the risk equation. If this man died because Dr. Whitfield refused him bed space, if his condition deteriorated while some administrator debated whether her personal connection violated some policy, then her son's sacrifice would mean nothing but a folder full of paperwork. Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway at 19:15 hours, his presence immediately making the air feel smaller, thinner. He scanned the patient for exactly 3 seconds, his lip curling into something that might have been a smile on a different man. "Why are you wasting time on this?" His voice carried that particular venom reserved for people he'd already decided weren't worth hospital resources. Bed 7 needs a central line. This vagrant can wait in the hallway. Or better yet, discharge him. Let the VA deal with it. Laura's jaw clenched once. Just once. Then her face returned to perfect neutrality. His vitals are unstable. Potential cardiac involvement. He needs monitoring. Whitfield stepped closer, and the antiseptic smell of the hospital suddenly mixed with something else, expensive cologne and the faint odor of coffee, his breath crossing the space between them as he leaned in. His voice dropped to that register he used when he wanted to be heard by everyone while appearing to speak only to her. I decide who needs what, sweetheart. And what you need is to learn your place before I make you disappear. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. Your employment file here is remarkably thin, you know. Barely 3 months. Previous job history almost non-existent. Makes a person wonder what you're hiding. Laura's hands didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. The trembling that wanted to happen, that every cell in her body urged her toward, came out instead as a current running beneath her skin, not fear. Restraint. She'd learned the difference in Kandahar, where one involuntary flinch could give away your position to an entire mountainside of people whose only job was to end your life. I'll monitor him closely, Doctor. If his condition changes. No. Whitfield straightened, already turning away. You'll move him to the hallway in 20 minutes. We need this bed. And Bennett? Stop wasting resources on people who don't matter. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the particular authority of someone who'd never been told no and wasn't about to start now. Laura stood motionless for 17 seconds, her hand still on the patient's for line. In that time, her mind constructed 3 different scenarios: Riker's condition deteriorating, Whitfield refusing to admit him to a monitored bed, the cascade of complications that followed. Cardiac tamponade was insidious. It started subtle, a gradual accumulation of fluid around the heart, and then suddenly the patient's blood pressure would collapse like a building with a severed load-bearing wall. She checked his jugular veins again. Still slightly distended. Still abnormal. The signs were there if you knew how to read them, and Laura had spent 15 years reading the language of crisis written across human bodies. She palmed the military ID again, feeling its edge against her fingers through the cotton of her scrub's pocket. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its actual mass, as if it carried more than just name and rank and service number. It carried obligation. Responsibility. The ghost of a promise she'd made to a boy who'd never come home. At 2,130 hours, Laura was charting Riker's vitals from a terminal in the corner of the ER when the monitor began telling a different story. Heart rate had drifted up to 88. Then 94. Then 102. Blood pressure had softened at the edges, 114/68, the kind of downward trend that seemed minor until you plotted it across the last few hours and realized it was falling at exactly 2 mm/hour. His skin, which had been pale when he arrived, had taken on a grayish cast now, the color of someone whose blood pressure was dropping and whose body was beginning the process of redistribution, pulling blood away from the periphery, away from the skin, trying desperately to keep the core organs perfused. She moved back to the bed without calling for help. Not yet. Not until she was absolutely certain. She placed her stethoscope against his chest and listened. The heart sounds were muffled, as if they were coming through water. Normal heart sounds were crisp and distinct, the first sound from the valve closure, the second sound from the other valve closure, separated by silence that was almost musical in its clarity. But Riker's sounds were dampened, quieted, as if something was surrounding the heart, compressing it, restricting its ability to fill properly between beats. Cardiac tamponade. The diagnosis formed in her mind with the certainty of someone who'd spent years learning to read these signs. She straightened and looked at the monitor, at the vital signs display that was now flashing with amber warnings, at the patient whose eyes were still closed but whose body was screaming silently that time had just become a currency he couldn't afford to waste. The military ID rested against her ribs, warm now from her body heat, and Laura made a choice that was going to cost her everything. She turned to find the nearest resident. I need a hospitalist. Now. And someone get me a crash cart positioned in this bay. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a question. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 15 years learning how to give orders in the darkest situations, and that voice was already beginning to break through the mask she'd been wearing since the day she arrived at Seattle General. At 0300 hours, the monitor alarm screamed. Not the warning beep. The full-code blue shriek that turns every head on the ward. Laura was at Riker's bedside in 4 seconds. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory from a decade of field trauma, from triage tents where the monitor's cry meant someone was about to die in front of you. His skin had turned the color of old concrete. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins bulging like cords. BP 70 over 40 and still falling. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the sac around his heart, crushing it. She didn't hesitate. She'd done this before in Fallujah when a blast fragment nicked the pericardium and a ranger's heart was drowning in its own fluid. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, arrived and froze, staring at the monitor as if it might explain itself. "We need a pericardiocentesis," Laura said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. Cardiology consult first. Protocol. He doesn't have time for protocol. He doesn't have 5 minutes. She was already moving. 18-gauge needle. Sterile field. The ultrasound cart rolled toward her like she'd summoned it with intention alone. She positioned the transducer, found the pocket of blood around his heart, a dark crescent moon on the screen, a visual confirmation of death waiting to happen. The syringe loaded. The needle angled toward the xiphoid process, 45 degrees upward toward the left shoulder. This was the moment where hands either shook or held steady. Hers held steady. "You can't perform this without authorization," Morrison said. Laura pushed the needle in. Felt the slight give as it penetrated the pericardial membrane. Then the hiss of fluid rushing into the syringe. Air escaping. Physics and anatomy and survival, all in that single motion. The first syringe filled. Then the second. 200 cc of blood that shouldn't be there, blood that was suffocating a man's heart. She withdrew it all with the precision of someone who'd trained in amphibious warfare medicine, who'd worked under fire with nothing but field kits and the knowledge that hesitation killed. The monitor's rhythm changed. Still rapid, but organized. The pressure coming off his heart easing. Oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 82 to 89. She could hear Morrison's breathing change behind her, the sound of a man watching something impossible happen in his own trauma bay. Where did you learn?" Morrison started. "Get him on telemetry. Continuous monitoring. Repeat ultrasound in 30 minutes. If the fluid reaccumulates, we'll need cardiothoracic on standby." Laura stepped back, the syringe of blood still in her hand like evidence. "Someone run labs. CBC, BMP, troponin, D-dimer. I need to know if this is still active bleeding or if the bleeding stopped and the pericardium just needed decompression." Morrison nodded. He looked at her differently now, not at the night shift nurse in the discount scrubs, but at someone whose hands had just pulled a man back from the edge of organ failure. 10 minutes later, Dr. Whitfield walked in. He'd been called about the code. She could tell by the way he stopped in the doorway, by the way his jaw clenched when he saw Riker's monitor showing a stable rhythm, by the way his eyes moved from the ultrasound machine to the sterile needle tray to Laura, who was now documenting the procedure with the same methodical precision she used for everything. "Who authorized a pericardiocentesis?" His voice was quiet. Dangerous quiet. "Patient was in cardiac arrest," Morrison said. "She performed an emergency decompression. He was crashing. Vitals were. I don't care if he was crashing." "Who authorized it?" Each word a hammer blow. Laura looked up from the charting. Met his eyes with the blank professional stare of someone who had nothing to apologize for. Immediate life threat. First responder protocols. You were on call and didn't answer. That was the mistake. Not performing the procedure. The mistake was the tone. The slight inflection that suggested she knew exactly why he hadn't answered, because he'd calculated that a homeless vagrant wasn't worth the intervention cost, wasn't worth the paper trail of proper treatment. Whitfield's face darkened. "You're done. Finished. You understand me? You violated the chain of command. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization from the attending physician. That's grounds for immediate suspension pending a full investigation. The patient was dying. Yes. Dying people are expensive. Dying people generate liability. And you, apparently, have a problem understanding that some patients aren't worth saving." He turned to Morrison. "Document this as an authorized procedure. I want a full incident report by 0800. And someone get this patient transferred to intensive care where he belongs, not because Bennett decided to play surgeon, but because protocol requires it." He left. The door hissed shut behind him like a mouth closing. By 0630, by the time Laura's shift was ending and the day staff was arriving with their coffee and complaints about traffic, Whitfield had made his calls. She found out later, when the unit secretary whispered it like a death sentence during report, he'd called Harrison on the hospital board at 0445. Called Chen at 0515. Called Paulson at 0547. Not calls. Demands. By 0800, he'd filed a formal complaint with the state nursing board. Unauthorized procedure. Practicing medicine without a license. Violation of hospital protocol regarding chain of command. The complaint read like he was describing a criminal. By 1000, an anonymous tip had arrived at the hospital's compliance office, information about a night shift nurse with a suspiciously sparse employment history, gaps in her background that didn't add up, no verifiable references before 3 months ago. The kind of thing that triggered deep audits. The kind of thing that made people ask questions about credentials, about prior employers, about why someone's history seemed to start from nothing. Laura sat in her Honda in the parking lot at 1015, a shift technically over at 0700, but she hadn't left. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing was still controlled. The rain hammered the windshield like it had a personal vendetta. She stared at the pair of worn combat boots on the passenger seat, the only thing her son had sent home before his last deployment to Fallujah, the thing she kept on the floor of her locker because it was the only piece of him left when the notification came, the only piece she'd let herself hold onto. The leather was cracked and salt-stained. The laces were frayed. She'd worn boots like those. She'd bled in boots like those. She dragged a squad out of a collapsing building in boots like those, dragged them out when the door was already fire, when the air was already lead and shrapnel, when the only reason anyone survived was because Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett decided that her life mattered less than theirs. But that was before. That was a different person. That was before Naval Special Warfare Command had erased her, had told her to disappear, had handed her a new social security number and a death certificate for the woman she'd been. She'd been a ghost for 15 years. Ghosts don't fight back. Ghosts don't let people see them. Ghosts perform pericardiocenteses in the dark and then fade back into the hallway, into the basement, into the parking garage at 0300 when no one's watching. Except Riker had seen her. Riker, who'd known her son. Riker, who'd survived Fallujah because people like her dragged him out when everything was burning. And now Riker was conscious in ICU, his heart pumping because she'd pushed a needle into his chest and removed his death sentence. And now Whitfield was going to bury her. The rain kept falling. The combat boots sat on the passenger seat like an accusation. She reached for them without thinking, let her fingers trace the leather, the sole, the place where her son's foot had molded the insole into a shape that would never belong to anyone else. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and whispered one word, no. Not a prayer. Not a question. A statement. Somewhere in this city, a different version of her was waking up. The one who'd had a choice in Kandahar, who'd been given an order to disappear and actually believed it. But ghosts don't just vanish. They wait. They watch. They remember who they are when someone needs them to. The rain hammered. The boots waited. And in the ICU, 3 floors above the parking garage, Colonel James Riker slept with his heart finally beating the way it was supposed to, because a woman who didn't exist anymore had decided to save him. By 0900 hours, the hospital's security team had already processed the paperwork. Laura's badge had been deactivated at 0847. 2 uniformed officers escorted her from the third-floor nursing station to the elevator without speaking, their presence a statement all by itself. This wasn't a resignation, this was a removal. Other nurses pretended not to watch as she walked past, but she felt their eyes. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they were nervous too. One of the officers held the elevator door. She stepped inside. The descent felt longer than it was. In the parking garage, the concrete amplified every footstep. The security team remained professional, distant, the way people are when they know they're enforcing something they don't understand. "Your personal items from your locker will be mailed to you," one of them said. Laura nodded. She said nothing about her past. She said nothing about the classified extraction in Kandahar that had been deemed sideways, the operation where everything went wrong, and Naval Special Warfare Command made the decision that Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett needed to stop existing. She didn't mention the 15 years of living as a ghost, the identity scrubbed from every database, the orders that were simple and absolute: disappear, don't surface, become invisible. She simply thanked them for their time, the words hollow but necessary, and watched them walk back toward the elevator. Her Honda sat in space 247, the same spot she'd parked in for 3 months. She got in. She closed the door. The engine stayed off. Her forehead found the steering wheel and stayed there. The parking garage smelled like motor oil and wet concrete. Rain had come through last night, the kind that fell sideways in Savannah, warm and relentless. She could still smell the antiseptic from her scrubs, the copper undertone from the blood she'd drawn from Riker's pericardial sac, the sharp ozone scent that lingers after a defibrillator fires. The smell of the ICU was still in her hair. In the passenger seat sat the pair of combat boots. They were the only thing she owned that mattered. Worn leather, creased at the arch from 1,000 miles of patrol, the laces still tied in a double knot from the last time hands other than hers had secured them. The boots had spent 8 months in a deployment container in Fallujah before they came home in a box marked personal effects. They'd sat in her apartment for 2 years before she found the courage to look at them without her vision fracturing. Then she'd placed them in her car the morning she'd started at Seattle General, a talisman that meant something only she understood. Her son had sent them home before his last patrol. Before Colonel James Riker had written the letter, the one that arrived in a manila envelope without a postmark, delivered by hand to her apartment by someone she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. The letter said David Bennett had died saving 3 men, including Riker. It said her son's last words were probably something like, "He clear the hallway off on my 6, military brevity for I love you." It said that Riker would have died in that building without David's covering fire. It said that in the world of soldiers, this was the highest honor a mother could receive, notification that her child had been exactly what he'd trained to be, exactly what he'd wanted to be. None of that made the boots less heavy. Laura had saved Riker's life with a single procedure, a needle at a 45-degree angle, hands moving with the muscle memory of 18 years in the military, pressure applied, fluid drained, a man's heart given oxygen again. And in doing so, she'd triggered the investigation that could unravel everything. Dr. Whitfield had been efficient about it. 3 phone calls to board members who owed him favors. A formal complaint to the State Nursing Board citing reckless endangerment and unauthorized invasive procedures. An anonymous tip to hospital investigators, anonymous in the way that everyone knew it came from him, the way bullies always maintain plausible deniability, questioning her suspiciously sparse employment history. The tip mentioned how she had no verifiable records before 15 years ago. No social security verification. No references from prior employment. Almost like she didn't exist, Whitfield had suggested in his cultured, courteous voice that made lies sound like concern. Almost like she didn't exist. Because she didn't. Not officially. Officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had been erased in a classified directive signed by someone 3 pay grades above where questions get asked. The extraction in Kandahar had gone sideways, that was the phrase used in the debriefing, the one she was allowed to remember because some things you can't forget even if the government orders you to. The operation had been compromised. Friendlies had been exposed. And one of those friendlies was Laura, embedded as what the file would have called external asset support, which meant she'd been outside the normal chain of command in ways that made her inconvenient to acknowledge if anything went wrong. Everything went wrong. The helicopter had taken fire on extraction. One of the pilots had taken fragmentation. Laura had talked him through a tracheotomy using a field knife and a piece of plastic tubing while the aircraft was still receiving small arms fire, because the alternative was losing the Black Hawk and everyone in it. It worked. The pilot survived. And then, 3 weeks later, a general in a secure facility had sat across from her and explained that Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett was now a liability. The operation would be classified for so long that she'd be dead before the files were declassified. The witnesses who could verify her heroism would never be allowed to testify. And the cleanest way to handle the situation was to make her disappear, not kill her, not dishonor her, but simply erase her from the system. New name. New social security number. New life. Work in a hospital. Keep your head down. Become a ghost. She had been a ghost for 15 years. And then she'd saved Colonel James Riker's life, and in saving him, she'd broken the first rule of being a ghost: don't let anyone know who you are. In the parking garage, Laura's hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in her world. Her breath came slow and measured, training, not panic, the difference between a soldier and a civilian being the ability to control your own physiology when everything is falling apart. She could have started the car. She could have driven home, packed a bag, and been across the Georgia border by midnight. She could have disappeared again, activated the contingency protocols that Naval Special Warfare Command had buried in her file in case this ever happened. But she didn't. She sat with her forehead against the wheel, and she stared at those combat boots, and she finally understood what the last 15 years had cost her. Not her identity, she'd made peace with losing that. Not her freedom, she'd built a life inside the constraints, a small good life, helping people at Seattle General, learning the rhythms of a civilian hospital, almost forgetting the weight of classified operations and extraction protocols. What the 15 years had cost her was the right to be seen. The boot sat in the passenger seat as evidence. Her son had lived. Her son had died. And she had spent 15 years not being allowed to claim either one. She had walked past her own son's commanding officer in a hospital hallway without acknowledgement, because acknowledging him would have been acknowledging who she was, and acknowledging who she was would have blown apart the entire legal fiction that was keeping her alive. Now the legal fiction had blown apart anyway. But this time, she'd blown it apart deliberately, for someone who'd known her son. For someone her son had died protecting. For the first time in 15 years, Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had chosen to be seen, if only for 90 seconds at 0300 hours, performing a procedure that only someone with her training could have performed. The rain started again outside the parking garage, fat drops hitting the concrete like small caliber rounds, percussion that meant something. Laura reached out and touched the boot nearest her, the leather still slightly stiff from the overseas climate, and she felt the tremor in her hands finally arrive, not in her chest, not in her voice, but in her hands, where the real shaking always happens in soldiers. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 15 years of holding herself together, finally understanding that the structure she'd been holding together had been designed by people who didn't know her name. She gripped the steering wheel. She pressed her forehead against it. And she waited, because waiting was something Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had learned to do better than almost anyone alive. She waited for whatever was coming next. She waited in the parking garage with her son's boots beside her, and she didn't turn the key. 2 days after her termination, Laura was in her apartment when the windows rattled, a military helicopter settling onto Seattle General's rooftop helipad, rotors drowning out the traffic below. The sound cut through everything, a deep bass thrum that made the picture frames vibrate on her shelves. She didn't move. She stood at her kitchen sink, hands submerged in cold dishwater, and listened to the percussion of blades chopping air. Some part of her already knew. The convoy arrived in Savannah's downtown corridor 30 seconds later, four black SUVs peeling into the hospital's main entrance with the precision of a tactical insertion. Laura could hear the sirens from 6 blocks away, getting closer, then stopping. She pulled her hands from the water. Let them drip. Didn't dry them. By the time she reached the hospital parking lot, a perimeter had already formed. Security had cordoned off the main entrance. News vans were rolling in from 3 different stations. Laura moved through the chaos like someone moving through rain, present but untouched. Her badge was gone, but nobody stopped her. They never did. The square-jawed Marine officer stood in the hospital's main atrium, asking every staff member the same question with the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Where is Sandcastle?" His voice had the texture of gravel under boots. "I'm looking for Sandcastle." No one answered. Nurses exchanged confused glances. Orderlies shook their heads. The operational call sign hung in the air like a ghost, her call sign, unspoken for 15 years, suddenly walking through these corridors like it had been waiting. Dr. Whitfield emerged from his office, confusion flickering across his face before settling into something darker. Recognition, maybe. Or the first cold touch of understanding that something had shifted in the architecture of his world. The hospital administrator rushed forward, attempting damage control, attempting to grasp the situation before it became something officially catastrophic. And then the silver-haired veteran security guard, the one who'd been watching Laura for weeks, the one whose eyes had softened every time she walked past his desk, stepped forward and spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from seeing a thing clearly and deciding, finally, to say it aloud. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Bennett, sir. Navy SEAL Support Operations." The room compressed into silence. Not the comfortable silence of routine hospital work. The kind of silence that happens when the ground shifts. Laura's hands, still damp from dishwater, hung at her sides. She didn't move. Didn't correct him. Didn't deny. The truth was standing on its own now, and denial would only waste time. The Marine officer's expression sharpened. His eyes found her across the atrium, and something ancient in his posture changed, recognition meeting recognition. He nodded once, a fraction of an inch, and stepped aside. A 2-star general emerged from the convoy, holding a tablet with the casualness of someone holding the weight of institutional memory. His uniform was dress blues, medals stacked like a chronicle of decisions made at 40,000 feet. He approached Laura directly, everyone else in the atrium suddenly peripheral to whatever was happening in this moment. "Master Chief Bennett." Not a question. A statement. "Your record precedes you." He turned the tablet toward her, and there it was, everything they'd erased, now restored, 11 classified missions, 2 Navy crosses stacked like proof of miracles, the surgical training that made her the only medic who'd ever talked a fighter pilot through a mid-flight tracheotomy over Fallujah while his left wing was burning. "Colonel Riker is conscious," the general continued. "He's been asking for you. Specifically by rank." The hospital administrator's face had gone the color of old paper. Dr. Whitfield's jaw tightened, his certainty beginning its collapse the way buildings collapse, suddenly, all at once, as if the foundation had been sand the entire time. 2 Army Rangers wheeled Colonel Riker into the atrium in a hospital-issue wheelchair, his uniform jacket draped over his shoulders like borrowed dignity. His color had improved. The distension in his neck was gone. The man who'd been dying on a stretcher 72 hours ago now looked directly at Dr. Whitfield with the clarity of someone who'd survived worse. "This woman saved my life twice," Riker said, his voice steady as a metronome. "Once in Fallujah when she dragged my entire squad out of a collapsing building, 300 kilograms of Rangers under fire, and once here when your hospital wanted to let me die in a hallway." He paused, let the weight of that land. "You wanted to move me." She refused. "That refusal is why I'm breathing." Dr. Whitfield opened his mouth. Closed it. His network had already begun its collapse in real time, Chen slipping toward the stairwell with his phone already to his ear, calling his attorney, Harrison, suddenly very interested in something on the far side of the building, Paulson frozen as 3 FBI agents in windbreakers entered through the main doors like they'd been waiting for their cue. A forensic auditor in a dark suit stepped forward with her own tablet, and her voice had the precision of someone who'd spent 48 hours excavating truth from accounting spreadsheets. $2.3 million in fraudulent billing over 18 months, she said. Phantom ICU hours. Consultations that never occurred. Diagnostic procedures billed but never performed. The shell companies receiving kickbacks have your signature on the incorporation papers, Dr. Whitfield. We have the calls to board members. We have the false complaints against Master Chief Bennett. Every piece of evidence you fabricated against her is now evidence of your own crimes. The silence was absolute. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum louder in the absence of human sound. The general's voice remained level, conversational, which somehow made it worse. You were willing to let a decorated combat officer die to protect your revenue stream. That's not malpractice. That's negligent homicide. He nodded to the officers. Secure the evidence. Whitfield's legs gave out. Actually gave out, like marionette strings had been cut. He reached for the information desk, missed, went down to one knee. His lawyer arrived within 60 minutes, but the damage was already published, medical license suspended pending criminal investigation, hospital privileges revoked, assets frozen. Security escorted him out past phone cameras capturing every frame for later consumption, his face already becoming a cautionary tale in medical ethics courses across the country. 6 months later, someone spotted him teaching CPR basics at a community college in the outlying suburbs for $15 an hour, his hands moving through the motions of resuscitation on a plastic dummy while paying students barely looked up from their phones. His name was becoming a footnote, already fading into the kind of obscurity reserved for the incompetent and the fallen. But that wasn't where this ended. That was only where it transformed. Laura stood on the hospital roof at sunset, the same helipad where the general's helicopter had descended, and she was wearing her dress uniform for the first time since Kandahar, the medals along her chest catching the last light like small metallic prayers. And on her feet, lace tight with 15 years of memory, the worn combat boots her son had sent home before his last deployment. Colonel Riker was being transferred to Walter Reed for continued recovery, his condition stable enough now to make the journey, to reclaim his life in increments. As the helicopter lifted away, a UH-60M Black Hawk ascending over Savannah with the precision of routine, he saluted from the window. His hand moved sharp and true, a gesture of respect that belonged to her. Laura saluted back. Her hand moved on its own, muscle memory and protocol combining into something that looked like ceremony. Her hand moved like it had been waiting 15 years to make that gesture in public, in daylight, where witnesses could see. No longer a ghost. No longer erased. The hospital had offered her chief of nursing. She'd declined. Instead, she'd accepted a position they'd created specifically for her, Director of Veteran Patient Advocacy, a title that meant her invisible years would finally serve visible purposes. Her son's sacrifice wouldn't echo in silence anymore. The veteran security guard approached as the helicopter disappeared into the purple distance, handing her a folder without ceremony. 17 other veterans on staff recognized you, Master Chief. We knew. We'd been watching. We were waiting for you to be ready. Laura took the folder. Inside were names. Ranks. The quiet infrastructure of people who'd seen combat and survived it, who'd known her not from resumes but from the way she moved through crisis, like someone who'd already crossed into territories most people couldn't imagine. Like someone whose composure wasn't learned but earned. She looked out at Savannah's skyline as the helicopter became a distant speck, then disappeared entirely. The sun was dropping fast, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. She thought of her son, of Riker, of every ghost who'd served in silence and wondered if anyone had seen them. She thought of 15 years underground, of being erased, of pushing through each day as if she were living in someone else's life. And she spoke the words that carried everything forward, her voice steady as stone. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The sunset held that moment perfectly, Laura Bennett standing in full dress uniform on a hospital rooftop, boots planted firm in the fading light, finally, after all these years, standing in the light instead of against it. If this story of hidden strength and quiet heroism moved you, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to remember that the quietest people in the room might just be the ones holding everything together.